The thing about reaching the stars, as it turned out, was that nobody bothered learning how to read them anymore. Across 17 sectors of charted space, encompassing 43 member species of what they pompously called the interstellar concordance, not a single sapient being could find their way out of a paper bag without a navigation computer telling them which way was up. This was considered progress. After all, why waste neural capacity on something as pedestrian as knowing where you were when algorithms could handle that tedious business? The Vorlaxians had abandoned traditional wayfinding approximately 8,000 years prior. The Zenthari never had it to begin with, having evolved as subterranean crystalline matrices that experience space as mathematical equations rather than physical reality. The Calorans, despite possessing compound eyes that could perceive in 17 different spectrums simultaneously, couldn't navigate their way across an empty room without technological assistance. This collective directional incompetence had never posed a problem because, well, technology never failed. Except when it did. And on Verdict 7, a planet whose official designation was promising research opportunity, and whose unofficial designation should have been magnetic hellscape that eats electronics for breakfast. It absolutely did. The expedition had seemed routine enough. 14 scientists, specialists, and support staff from 7 different species, all crammed into a survey vessel designed to study Verdict 7's unusual geological formations. The planet boasted mineral deposits that shouldn't exist according to conventional physics, crystal formations that seemed to grow in non-Euclidean patterns, and enough raw scientific mystery to justify the 6-month journey from civilized space. What the preliminary scans had failed to mention, or perhaps had mentioned in footnotes that nobody read because who reads footnotes, was that Verdict 7's magnetic field fluctuated with all the predictability of a drunken gymnast. One moment you had perfect sensor readings, the next moment every electronic system on your ship was convinced it was simultaneously at the North Pole, the South Pole, and somehow 3 kilometers underground. The landing itself went smoothly, which should have been the first warning sign. The ship touched down in a valley surrounded by ridges of rust-colored stone, near what the sensors had identified as a geologically significant formation worth investigating. The crew disembarked, set up base camp, collected samples, ran tests, and generally did science at geology for 6 productive hours. Then someone made the mistake of turning off the ship's primary systems to run diagnostics, and when they tried to turn them back on, the navigation array decided it had had enough of this nonsense and simply refused to acknowledge that it knew where it was, where it had been, or indeed that location was even a meaningful concept. "This is suboptimal," announced Thane Cross, the Vorlaxian mission commander, which was roughly equivalent to a human screaming, "We're all going to die," while their hair caught fire. Thane stood approximately 2 meters tall, with 6 eyes arranged in a hexagonal pattern around his head that theoretically gave him 360-degree vision. In practice, this meant he could see in all directions simultaneously while understanding none of them. At the moment, all 6 eyes were focused on the navigation console with an intensity that suggested he believed glaring at it might restore functionality through sheer willpower. "Suboptimal," agreed Kip, the Zenthari geological specialist, whose crystalline body chimed softly with distress frequencies. "The ship's positional matrix has collapsed. Without reference coordinates, we cannot calculate a return vector to base camp if we venture beyond visual range." "We are at base camp," Morvath pointed out, her compound eyes glittering with what might have been confusion, or might have been the way light refracted through her insectoid visual organs. Nobody could ever quite tell. "For now," Kip chimed ominously. The full scope of their predicament became apparent over the next 30 minutes as various crew members attempted to solve the problem using their species' particular brand of advanced intelligence. Thane attempted to use stellar cartography, a method his people had abandoned millennia ago but which surely couldn't be that difficult to resurrect. Unfortunately, this required seeing stars, and it was currently mid-afternoon on a planet with a bright yellow sun that made stellar observation somewhat challenging. He stood outside the ship for 20 minutes staring at the sky, all 6 eyes watering, before admitting defeat. Kip tried to create a mathematical model of their surroundings, measuring angles and distances with crystalline precision. The resulting equations were beautiful, elegant, and utterly useless for the practical purpose of knowing which direction led back to this exact spot. Math, it turned out, could describe space perfectly while being completely unhelpful for navigating through it. Morvath attempted to lay down pheromone markers, an ancient Kelleran technique mentioned in historical texts. The wind, demonstrating either a sense of humor or complete indifference, immediately blew them away. She tried again. The wind blew harder, as if offended by her persistence. 2 Drexarians suggested building a large fire as a beacon, then realized they'd need to leave camp to make the beacon useful, and they'd need a beacon to find their way back to light the beacon, creating a logical paradox that made both their head ridges hurt. A Forian engineer proposed disassembling the navigation system and rebuilding it from scratch, which would take approximately 4 weeks and required parts they didn't have. A Quellan physician recommended everyone remain calm and hydrated, which was excellent medical advice and spectacularly unhelpful for their current situation. After 3 hours of increasingly desperate problem-solving attempts, the crew had managed to achieve absolutely nothing, except confirming that they were, in the technical parlance of interstellar exploration, monumentally screwed. If anyone wandered more than 100 meters from camp, there was no guarantee they could find their way back. The ridge surrounding the valley all looked identical. The rust-colored rocks offered no distinguishing features. Without navigation systems, they might as well have been blindfolded in a maze. Perhaps we should simply wait for rescue, suggested one of the Drexarians, whose name was Vect and whose optimism was touching if misplaced. The rescue window isn't for another 40 days, Thane said, 3 of his eyes closing in what his species did instead of sighing. Our supplies won't last that long. We need to reach the secondary supply cache at Landing Site Gamma. And where precisely is Landing Site Gamma? Kip chimed, though the harmonics suggested they already knew the answer. 17.3 kilometers northeast, Thane said. And which direction is northeast? Silence descended over the camp like a wet blanket made of embarrassment. That was when Marcus Brennan, who had been sitting on a supply crate quietly eating a ration bar, cleared his throat. I could probably figure it out. 14 pairs of eyes, eye clusters, and optical sensors swiveled toward the human equipment specialist. Marcus was unremarkable by human standards, average height, average build, with brown hair that stuck up in odd directions, and a face that suggested he found the universe mildly amusing. He'd been assigned to the expedition because humans, despite their numerous shortcomings in the eyes of most species, had an odd knack for keeping equipment running with improvised repairs and what they called percussive maintenance.
Figure it out how? Thane asked. All 6 eyes narrowing skeptically, Marcus gestured vaguely at the ridge surrounding them. Climb up there, take a look around, see what's what. Make a map. Find some landmarks. Basic orienteering. Orienteering, Kip repeated, testing the word like it might be toxic. That's a primitive surface navigation technique. Sure is, Marcus agreed cheerfully. Works great though. Without instruments, without technological assistance. Morvath's antenna twitched with disbelief. Well, yeah. I mean, I've got eyes. I can see the sun.
That's really all you need for a start. The crew exchanged glances, or the multi-species equivalent thereof. The expressions ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief, with a few stopping at, "Is this human experiencing a medical emergency?" "You're proposing to navigate using celestial observation and visual landmarks," Thanar said slowly, as if explaining the concept to himself. "Methods that haven't been seriously employed by spacefaring species in thousands of years." "I mean, we still use them on Earth," Marcus said. "Camping, hiking, wilderness stuff. It's fun." "Fun," Morvith repeated flatly. "You do this recreationally." Kip's harmonics reached frequencies, usually reserved for expressing profound confusion. "Sure, you've never gone camping. I am a crystalline matrix grown in a nutrient solution and sustained by electromagnetic resonance. I don't do recreational anything." "Fair point," Marcus conceded. He finished his ration bar and stood up, brushing crumbs off his uniform. "Look, we need to get to this supply cache, right? And nobody here has a better idea, right? So why don't I climb up that ridge, see what I can see, and we'll go from there." The crew's objections came rapid fire. It was dangerous. It was unreliable. It was based on primitive methodology that advanced civilizations had abandoned for good reason. Marcus listened patiently to each concern, nodded thoughtfully, and then started walking toward the ridge anyway. "I'm not asking permission," he called over his shoulder. "I'm just letting you know where I'll be." The climb took 40 minutes, and Marcus was very aware of multiple eyes tracking his progress up the rocky slope. The ridge wasn't particularly steep, but the loose rock made footing tricky. He picked his way carefully, testing each handhold, moving with the steady patience of someone who'd done this sort of thing before. Behind him he could hear worried chittering and chiming from the assembled aliens, probably discussing the statistical probability of the human falling and breaking something important. At the top, Marcus paused to catch his breath and take in the view. The valley spread below him, their ship a small metallic dot at its center. Beyond the valley, the landscape rolled out in waves of rust and amber, broken by darker patches that might be vegetation or mineral deposits, or possibly both. To what he was pretty sure was the east, he could see a glint of water. To the north, a distinctive rock formation rose like a crooked finger pointing at the sky. West showed more ridges, marching away toward the horizon. South, the direction they'd presumably come from during landing, revealed flatter terrain. Marcus pulled out his personal tablet. Unlike the ship's navigation systems, it wasn't sophisticated enough to be bothered by magnetic interference. It could still take notes, draw simple shapes, and record observations. He began sketching. The sun was slightly past its zenith, tracking westward. That gave him a rough east-west axis. The valley ran primarily north-south. The rock formation to the north, which looked like someone had stacked boulders drunk, would make an excellent landmark. The water to the east, possibly a lake or wide river, was another reference point. He noted the color variations in the rock, the patterns of darker vegetation, the way the ridges created natural corridors between them. For 20 minutes, Marcus stood on that ridge doing what his species had done for hundreds of thousands of years before they ever dreamed of space travel. He looked at the land, understood it, and remembered it. He built a mental map, layer by layer, anchored by distinctive features and verified by the sun's position. Then he sketched it on his tablet, translating the three-dimensional reality into a two-dimensional representation that could be shared and understood. When he climbed back down, the entire crew was waiting with expressions ranging from curious to desperate. "Well?" Thane asked. Marcus held up his tablet, displaying a crude but functional map. "Okay, so we're here. Northeast of us, maybe 18 to 20 kilometers, there's a rock formation that looks like a drunk giant playing Jenga. That's got to be visible from landing site Gamma. If we head that direction, we should be able to spot the supply cache once we're in range. That's your navigation plan? Morvith asked. Walk toward a rock. Simplified, but yeah. We'll use the sun to maintain our bearing, adjust course based on landmarks, and check position from high ground every few kilometers. Basic dead reckoning. Dead reckoning, Keep chimed nervously. That name does not inspire confidence. It's what sailors use to navigate oceans, Marcus explained. Works pretty well if you're paying attention. Sailors, ocean navigation. Both concepts are species abandoned when we achieved spaceflight, Thane said, but there was something in his voice beyond skepticism now. Curiosity, maybe. Or desperation. Look, Marcus said, I know this seems primitive to you guys, but before we had computers telling us where to go, we actually paid attention to where we were. We noticed things, patterns, landmarks, the way light changes through the day. The skills didn't disappear because they got old, they just got forgotten. And if you're wrong, Vect asked. If your primitive dead reckoning leads us in circles, Marcus shrugged. Then we're no worse off than we are right now, standing in this valley arguing about it. But I'm not wrong. I've done this on 3 continents back home. The principles don't change just because we're on a different planet. Another exchange of glances rippled through the crew. Finally, Thane's shoulders sagged slightly, a gesture Marcus had learned meant resignation among Vorlaxians. I suppose we have little choice. We cannot stay here, and we cannot navigate using any of our species' methods. If the human believes he can lead us to landing site Gamma using archaic techniques, then we must trust him. Great, Marcus said. We should leave at first light tomorrow. Moving during the day means I can track the sun's position. Everyone pack light. We'll need to cover 20 kilometers, maybe more if the terrain forces detours. The night passed with an tension that no amount of double-checking supplies could quite dispel. Marcus spent an hour after sunset studying the stars, not because he needed them for navigation, but because they provided a backup reference. He recognized a few constellations from the pre-mission briefing materials. That bright cluster to the north would rise predictably. If they got turned around, the stars would tell them so. Morning came with a sunrise that painted the valley in shades of copper and gold. Marcus stood facing the dawn, orienting himself, double-checking his mental compass. When the crew assembled, he pointed northeast. That way. Stay together. Keep conversation down so I can think, and trust me. Famous last words, someone muttered. But they fell into line. The journey began simply enough. Marcus led them out of the valley through a gap in the ridges, keeping the rising sun on his right. Every few hundred meters, he'd stop and look around, comparing what he saw to the map in his head and the sketch on his tablet. The rock formations had personalities once you learned to see them. That one looked like a wave frozen mid-crash. This one had striations that ran diagonal, distinctive. A patch of dark vegetation grew in the shadow of a boulder, marking a depression where water probably collected. The aliens followed in uncertain silence, occasionally whispering to each other in frequencies Marcus couldn't fully hear. He could sense their doubt, their discomfort at trusting their survival to methods they considered obsolete. Every time he changed direction slightly to follow the terrain, he felt their anxiety spike. After 2 hours, they reached a low rise. Marcus climbed it, scanned the horizon, and felt satisfaction settle in his chest. The drunk giant rock formation was visible, slightly to their left. He'd been drifting east, probably compensating for a slight downhill grade. easy to correct. "We're on track," he called down. "About 15 kilometers to go." "How can you possibly know that?" Kip chimed. Marcus pointed at the rock formation. "That's where we're going. It's closer than before, therefore we've made progress." "Math you'd approve of." "That's not math, that's observation." "Math starts with observation," Marcus said. "Come on, we want to reach that formation before dark." By midday, even the most skeptical crew members were starting to understand the method to Marcus's madness. He'd stop at high points, scan the terrain, identify markers. That cluster of boulders 3 kilometers ahead. They'd use that as a waypoint, the dry stream bed cutting northeast. They'd follow it because it went their direction and provided easier walking. When Morvath asked how he knew it was a stream bed and not just a random depression, Marcus pointed out the smooth rocks, the way vegetation grew thicker on the banks, the subtle downhill grade. Signs that seemed obvious once someone pointed them out but invisible, if you'd spent your entire existence letting computers handle the looking. The aliens began to ask questions. How did he know they weren't walking in circles? Marcus showed them how the sun's movement told direction. Why did he pause to look at moss on rocks? Because moss grew thicker on the shaded side, which helped confirm which way was north in this hemisphere. What did he mean by terrain features? He explained how valleys channeled movement, how ridges served as natural walls, how understanding the land's shape told you where you could and couldn't go. Thane, walking beside Marcus after one such explanation, made a sound like escaping steam. "Your species retained these skills because you achieved spaceflight so recently. You haven't had time to evolve past them." "Maybe," Marcus said. "Or maybe we just like camping too much to let them go. There's something satisfying about knowing where you are without needing a computer to tell you." "Satisfying," Thane repeated, testing the word. "Our people would call it inefficient." "Your people can't find their way out of a valley without a GPS," Marcus pointed out. "Which of us is really being efficient?" They reached the rock formation as the sun touched the horizon, painting the landscape in long shadows. Marcus climbed the base of the formation, scouted the area beyond, and allowed himself a grin. There, maybe 3 kilometers northwest, he could see the regular geometric shape of landing site Gamma's supply cache. The relief shelter's solar panels caught the dying light like a beacon. "There," he pointed. "That's our destination. We'll camp here tonight and cover the last stretch in the morning." The crew gathered around to look, following his pointing finger. One by one, they spotted it. The reaction was a mixture of relief, amazement, and what Marcus suspected was embarrassment. They'd doubted him for an entire day, and he'd led them directly to their goal using nothing but eyes, sunlight, and attention. Kip approached Marcus as they set up camp, crystalline body refracting the last rays of sunlight. "I must ask, how did you learn these techniques? Is this standard human education?" Marcus laughed. "Not exactly. My dad was big on camping and hiking. Taught me and my siblings to navigate before we could drive. Said computers were great until they weren't, and then you'd better know how to read the land. Your progenitor was wise." "He was paranoid," Marcus corrected. "But yeah, it turns out he was also right." They reached the supply cache the next morning, and the crew fell on it like shipwreck survivors finding an island. Food, water, communication equipment that worked because it was shielded differently than the ship's systems. Within an hour, they'd contacted the Concordance and arranged emergency extraction. Within 3 hours, a rescue ship was en route. Sitting in the shade of the supply shelter, Thane approached Marcus with something that might have been humility in his posture. "I owe you an apology."
When you suggested your primitive navigation methods, I believed we were trusting our survival to archaic superstition. And now, Marcus asked. Three of Thane's eyes focused on the horizon, where they'd come from. Now I understand that what we call primitive, you call foundational. We built our civilization on top of these skills, then forgot they existed. You maintained them, refined them, and when our advanced technology failed, your archaic methods succeeded. He paused, all six eyes swiveling to Marcus. The Concordance will hear about this, not just as a survival story, but as a lesson in what we've lost in our rush to progress. I mean, I just climbed a ridge and paid attention, Marcus said, uncomfortable with the solemnity. It's not that deep. That keep chimed, approaching from the shelter, is precisely what makes it profound. The simplicity we dismissed is the foundation we forgot. Every species in the Concordance has abandoned basic wayfinding. We trusted technology absolutely, and created a catastrophic vulnerability. You humans, still young to the stars, remember what we've forgotten.
So what? I'm going to teach aliens to use compasses now, perhaps, Thane said seriously. The Interstellar Concordance may need to add a new educational requirement. Basic navigation skills, taught by humans. Marcus considered this, then grinned. You guys are going to feel really silly in survival training classes taught by the species you usually call primitive. Yes, Thane agreed. But we will feel silly while knowing which direction is north. That seems like a fair trade. The rescue ship arrived 3 days later, and the crew's story spread through the Concordance with the speed of scandalized gossip. Advanced species, lost without their technology. One human, using methods older than written language, leading them to safety. The jokes wrote themselves. So did the policy changes. Within a year, the Concordance had implemented mandatory basic navigation training for all personnel on planetary missions. The classes, universally, were taught by humans who found the whole situation hilarious. Nothing quite matched the sight of a Vorlaxian commander, six eyes squinting at the sun, trying to determine which way was east, or a Zenthary crystalline matrix, attempting to understand that sometimes math needed to step aside for simple observation. Marcus returned to Earth between missions, visited his father, and shared the story over beers on the back porch of the old family cabin. His dad listened, laughed, and raised his bottle in a toast. To the skills nobody thinks they need, he said, until they do. Marcus clinked bottles and looked up at the stars, visible now that night had fallen and the sky had cleared. Somewhere up there, probably several dozen light years away, an alien was struggling to use moss to find north. The thought made him smile. Humanity had reached the stars using computers and complex mathematics, riding technological advancement into the cosmos. But when technology failed, when the computers went dark and the navigation systems crashed, it turned out that the ability to climb a ridge, read the land, and remember the way back wasn't primitive at all. It was essential. It was fundamental. And most importantly, it was the one thing the advanced civilizations had forgotten in their rush toward progress. The species that still went camping for fun, that taught their children to navigate by sun and stars before they learned calculus, that maintained the old skills alongside the new ones. They were the species that could find their way home when everyone else was lost. Which was, when you thought about it, exactly the kind of ridiculous irony the universe specialized in. Everyone had gone looking for the future among the stars, and somehow forgotten that the past, with all its primitive skills and archaic methods, might occasionally be worth remembering. Lucky for them, one species hadn't gotten that memo. Lucky for them, humans still knew which way was north. even if it was just because they thought getting lost in the woods sounded like a fun weekend.